So this presentation of the chair's text, the one that was released on the 8th of November, really reflects our IISD's reading of that text as the text as it currently stands. Other readings are possible. Our interpretation of what the provisions mean is not the only interpretation, so we'd be interested in hearing your interpretations. You know, hear the slides, hear the presentation and read the slides with that reading in mind, please. Also worth noting, of course, that other ideas and proposals aren't captured. There have been a lot of textual proposals over the last few weeks that haven't made it into the text. And so there are clearly members who have very strong positions on some parts of the text that they don't yet see reflected in the text. So in focusing on the text, we are not by any means excluding those from the universe of options. We just thought it would be helpful to focus on what we have in the text, and then we can think about everything else. An obvious point, but one that's always worth reinforcing: nothing is agreed yet. All of the text in the sense is in square brackets. Some areas are more stabilized, and of course the chair inserts or removes brackets to try and reflect his view of which areas are more stabilized than others. But areas of disagreement still remain. Some of those areas of disagreement are marked with square brackets, and I've tried to reflect the current range of square brackets in the slides. But there are also a range of areas of disagreement, even where there is clean text. So again, even if I present the text as sort of what the rules are going to look like, please bear in mind that there's a lot of negotiating still to be done between now and the ministerial. And the last caveat I have to say is that I am taking the great risk of presenting this without having had my colleague Tristan check the slides for errors, which is what he usually does. So all of the errors are mine, and please point them out at the end so that I can make sure the slides that we upload onto the website are clean. So with that, a quick run through of what's in the text and where some of the key changes, at least we see, are the key changes made in the 8th of November draft. So starting with the scope and definitions articles, that's articles 1 and 2 in the text. The basic approach you'll all be very familiar with. The new agreement applies to specific subsidies provided to fishing and fishing related activities that take place at sea. So again, we're not talking about aquaculture, inland fishing, subsidies to onshore activities like processing. One important pair of brackets that are still there are the brackets around Article 1.2, which would include in the scope of the agreement non-specific fuel subsidies. This is a contentious point, as many of you will know. Some members argue that from an environmental perspective, a non-specific fuel subsidy is as damaging as a specific one if it benefits fishers. Others argue that extending the scope of the rules to cover all fuel consumption subsidies that might benefit fishing could create a lot of uncertainty around exactly which subsidies are captured by these rules. And this, I suspect, is going to be an important part of the overall political bargain that will form the final agreement. One important change to note here is that the current text removes the requirement in the definition of operator that that operator be somebody on board a vessel. This, I think, widens the scope of that concept so that it can include companies that might operate one or more vessels. I think that the chair, judging by his note, chose not to explicitly say that an operator could be, in the legal parlance, a natural or juridical person, i.e. a person like me or a company, but that's the understanding, that it could be an operator in the form of a natural person or a company. And this becomes important when we get to the operation of the IUU subsidy discipline, which is what we get to next. So you'll all be very familiar with this. The overall approach is members must not provide subsidies to fishing vessels or operators if a coastal or a flag state or a relevant regional fisheries management organisation has made an affirmative determination that that vessel or operator has engaged in IUU fishing. And the first important change in the 8th of November text is actually right at the very beginning of this article, in paragraph 3.1. where the chair's inserted in brackets language that says subsidies are prohibited to vessels and operators engaged in IUU fishing and to fishing related activities in support of such IUU. And this was an idea in a proposal that included links to forced labour, but the labour issue isn't explicitly noted here. And the idea, I think, and we might come back to this in the discussion, but the idea here, I think, is that a vessel, If a vessel is the subject of an IUU determination, subsidies are prohibited to that vessel and to other activities that support or work with that IUU vessel. This would, if it's this interpretation, that would widen the scope of the prohibition. Although, of course, in real life, the difference is probably likely to have an impact really in more sophisticated fisheries, where you have support vessels working with fishing vessels. But there's an open question there about whether it's just a determination of IUU by a fishing vessel, or whether you also need a determination of IUU by a support vessel, for example, by being engaged in illegal transshipment, which could be something that a support or carrier vessel might engage in. So that's an open question that we might come to later on. Now, that's the first change to be aware of, the addition of the fishing-related activities. Two long-standing issues in this article are sort of the same as they have always been. The first is how automatic is the trigger. So the chair has left in the text the basic balance from his June text. The subsidising member is under an obligation, subject to an obligation to remove its subsidies, but the subsidising member can decide how long that prohibition should last for. Some proposals, I gather, have asked to remove the minimum duration requirement, but these haven't gathered wide support, so the text is more or less as it is in June. Where there is an interesting change is in what's required before a coastal state's determination might trigger the prohibition. Sorry, and so there's the grace period, which I'll come back to in just a second. So we now have two alternatives in Article 3.3, which set out the procedures, essentially, that a coastal state needs to follow or needs to build into its determination process to ensure that a determination is a valid trigger for a subsidy rule. So alternative 1 in the text is the same as what was in the June text. It requires a determination to be based on positive evidence and requires it to follow due process, including, well, which consists of providing the flag and the subsidising member, if known, with notification of the initiation of an investigation and an opportunity to submit information to that determination process. So two things, notification and the opportunity to submit information. Now there's now in the text an alternative 2, which has been proposed by several members. And it does, I think, two things. Firstly, it moves away from the use of the phrase due process. In part, I understand, I think reading through the chair's comment, that some members don't want to pin down this legal concept of due process into very specific steps. Perhaps because that might have implications for how the concept is read in other agreements or even in other fora. So we move away from the concept of due process, but we would then have two specific steps, notification and the opportunity to provide information. So these are steps the coastal state has to follow for a determination to trigger the obligation. But each of those steps is a little bit different in Alt 2 from in Alt 1. So in Alt 1, the notification is only of the beginning of an investigation. In Alt 2, the notification could be at one of 2 points, either when a vessel is detained or when an investigation is initiated, as in Alt 1. So members, I think, would need to choose between one of those options. And perhaps just to note that the concept of an initiation of an investigation probably covers a lot more circumstances than a vessel detention. So an investigation may not begin or even involve the actual detention of a vessel necessarily. So that's the first bit, the notification point. And then in Alt 2, the opportunity to provide information includes through providing the flag state subsidising member with the opportunity for dialogue if the flag or subsidising member requests it. So this opportunity for dialogue probably gives the flag or subsidising member more access to the determination process, a chance to actually explain its point of view, but the coastal state would, or the coastal member, would keep control of the timetable. Right? So there's a last bit in Alt 2 that says the coastal state can specify when and how information, presumably including through the dialogue process, is provided. So the differences between Alt 1 and Alt 2 are subtle, but they depend on different views, different legal views, I think, of what the procedural requirements should be. An important footnote just to remember in all of this context, nothing in this article, presumably including all of these procedural requirements, can be used to delay or affect the validity of an IUU determination. And both of these concepts are quite important. Delay we've already talked about, I think, but validity is important because it means that if you make a determination and you try and use that to stop a member from providing subsidies to this vessel or operator, if eventually the whole thing ends up in a WTO dispute process and for some reason a WTO panel finds that you didn't follow one of these procedural requirements, it doesn't mean the determination is thrown out. The determination still stands as a matter of national law. It just may not have an effect as a trigger of a subsidy obligation under this treaty. So that I think is an important kind of reassurance and clarification for members. So this section looks at Article 4, the basic prohibition, sorry, my light's going off. The basic prohibition, which is that most subsidies are prohibited when there's essentially a decision or a determination that a stock is overfished. Now, the basic rule, still quite strict. All subsidies to overfished stocks are prohibited, but only when a national authority or IFMO recognizes that it's overfished. And there's still the same text proposing two different varieties of exemptions from that rule. So this hasn't changed in the November draft from the June draft. The first idea is a relatively narrow exemption for subsidies implemented to promote the rebuilding of the stock. And the second, which is still in brackets, is a wider prohibition. So it would allow other subsidies to be provided if measures are implemented to ensure the rebuilding of the stock. So this has been sort of quite a contentious point, and in fact this is a point that many environmental groups feel quite strongly about. So we're going to hear some perspectives, I think, on this part of the text on Friday's webinar. Just to note here, there's been a small change to the footnotes in Article 4 and Article 5. Now it's just one footnote that defines what a biologically sustainable level is. And essentially, as I read the change, it removes sort of a long list of possible indicators on which you could base a reference point. But to my reading, this doesn't change the overall meaning of the footnote. It still allows the use of maximum sustainable yield as a reference point or other reference points as determined by the coastal state or the relevant regional fisheries management organization. But I'd be keen to hear if other people read it like I do. I'll touch on the SNDT provision here because there's a small change in the SNDT for overfished stocks and for the IUU articles. And it is simply that there are now brackets around the geographic extent of this exception. So it's actually more of what legally you would call a grace period. So the obligation in Article 4 applies, the obligations in Article 3 apply, but they cannot be challenged for subsidies provided by developing countries to low-income, resource poor and livelihood fishing or fishing-related activities for 2 years within, the text currently says 12 nautical miles. Now there's brackets around the 12, essentially because there's a sort of cross-cutting question across the agreement about whether that geographic limit makes sense for artisanal fisheries. So that's one small change there, but it's a point that we're going to get to in just a second when we get to Article 5. So Article 5, you'll all be very much aware, has been the subject of a lot of discussion around what the chair often calls the meta issues about the overall balance in this article, because it's a really important one for the impact of the whole agreement. And there have been quite a few significant changes here, so I'm going to spend some time on them. So the first big change is that what used to be paragraph 5.2, which prohibited subsidies contingent on fishing in areas outside your own EEZ, has been moved into Article 5.1. That has two implications, at least as I see it. The first is that that rule is now subject to the 5.1.1 qualification or exception. There it is. So members would now still be able to provide these subsidies contingent on fishing outside their EEZ if they can demonstrate measures are in place to keep the relevant stocks at a sustainable level. It also means that this rule subsidies contingent on is now subject to the special and differential treatment provisions, which are now in what's now Article 5.4, used to be 5.5, now it's 5.4. And so just to think through those implications a little bit, so for 5.1.1, it means members can provide subsidies contingent on fishing in another member's EEZ if the member can show that there are measures in place to keep stocks in that other EEZ at a sustainable level, it means members can provide subsidies contingent on fishing in an RFMO area if it can show measures are in place to keep stocks in that under the control of the RFMO at a sustainable level. So that's one big change. We're going to get to 5.4 in a moment, but just thinking through the links between this new movement into 5.1, it means that, so we have in Article 5.4 in SNDT, exemption for artisanal fishing, exemptions for non-artisanal fishing in EEZs, and exemptions now for de minimis members, sort of group members who fall under a de minimis threshold. We now have in Article 6, that's been moved, an LDC exemption from Article 5.1. So what does all of this mean for this move? I think it means that because we have an LDC exemption from 5.1, it means that LDCs have a permanent exemption from this prohibition as well, subject to best endeavours and a best endeavours obligation to make sure the subsidies don't contribute to overcapacity. It's now subject to the artisanal exemption, which probably doesn't have a lot of impact because that artisanal exemption is likely to be limited either to 12 nautical miles or to 200. But it does mean that this rule is also subject to the EEZ and RFMO exemption for developing members' non-artisanal subsidies. So developing members would be able to provide these subsidies contingent on fishing outside their EEZ, perhaps for X number of years, and that X is still subject to negotiation. It also means that members subject to the de minimis exemption, or members who can use the de minimis exemption, could continue to provide these subsidies without having to demonstrate 5.1.1 and just being under a sort of best endeavours obligation to show the subsidies aren't contributing to overcapacity and overfishing. So it's a significant change and one to think about quite carefully. I'll move on then perhaps to 5.4 because that's what we've already started thinking about. And this is another big change, another area where there's been a big change. So the text in June had two alternatives in Article 5.5, Alternative 1 and Alternative 2. There's now just one set of provisions on special and differential treatment, so we removed the two alternatives. And in fact, the two alternatives, when you looked at them, actually contain several similar ideas. So this text essentially narrows down all the various options into just one set. But it also reorganizes the options a bit, just to confuse us. So I'm going to take them in the order that they now are in the text. So first, there's a time-limited exemption from Article 5.1 and 5.1.1 for subsidies to non-artisanal fishing by developing countries, subject to a couple of restrictions, potentially a geographical restriction, the idea that it's limited to fishing within EEZs and RFMOs. This is still in brackets because it's the subject of some debate, and subject to a time limit. It seems now relatively certain that there will be a time limit. It's just a question of how long. The chair's text in June suggested 5 years. Other proposals have suggested 25 years. So perhaps we're going to land somewhere in the middle. So that's non-artisanal commercial fishing in the EEZ. There's also instead not a time limited but a permanent exemption for subsidies to artisanal fishing. This is language we're all now familiar with: low income, resource poor and livelihood fishing, subject to just one restriction, and that's geographical. And here, the idea that it would be limited to 12 nautical miles, the 12 is in brackets, just as we saw for SNDT for IUU and overfished, because there's debate around whether this 12 nautical mile limit is appropriate for artisanal fishing and its exemption. There's also a permanent exemption from 5.1.1 and 5.1 for subsidies provided by de minimis members, or members who are less than a de minimis level of global catch. So those that contribute less than 0.7% individually of global catch have a permanent exemption from 5.1. The last point to make here is actually a really important one, particularly from the perspective, I think personally, of the overall balance of the agreement and the sustainability that we're trying to achieve or encourage with this agreement. So now in 5.4, there is a sort of soft sustainability requirement attached to the use of all of the exemptions: commercial, artisanal, and de minimis fishing. So members using 5.4 are required to endeavour to ensure that their subsidies don't contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. So they should, in other words, do their best to ensure that these subsidies that by Article 4, they're allowed to provide without having to prove 511, do their best to ensure those subsidies aren't contributing to overcapacity or overfishing. So it's a much lower requirement than 511, as perhaps it might logically be. Of course, remember that for the non-artisanal fishing, the exemption from 511 is time limited. So once the time period, whether it's 5 or 25 or somewhere in the middle, once that expires, those subsidies would begin to become subject to 5.1. So governments could continue to provide them, but they'd have to match them with management. So I think, on this slide, your questions really are the things in bold. For non-artisanal fishing, how long is the time limit? What's the geographical scope of the exemption? For artisanal fishing, again, what's its geographical scope? What's the geographical scope of that exception? And for the de minimis exemption, what's the percentage we will end up with? And I know that there are probably some hot debates going on about whether it should be 0.7, as it is in the current text, or something a bit above. And lastly, of course, a question, is the best endeavours sustainability requirement appropriate in this context? So those are all open questions, but in thinking about the structure of Article 5, I think those are important things to focus on. There are 2 additional prohibitions, just 2 now, in Article 5, that are not subject to special differential treatment. So we'll deal with them separately here. Oops, let's start with that one. So there is sort of the old, what I'll call the old high seas rule. It used to be Article 5.3 and it's now Article 5.2, that covers all subsidies but has quite a narrow geographic scope. So it covers subsidies only for fishing on the high seas outside the competence of an RFMO. So that remains not subject to S&DT. But the last change to be aware of in Article 5 is the addition of 2 options for the reflagging rule, what I call the reflagging rule. Essentially, it was the idea, it used to be Article 5.4, the idea of prohibiting subsidies to vessels not flying the flag of the member providing the subsidy. That's what it used to be, and that's what is still reflected in Alternative 1 for this paragraph. But the idea behind this rule, and it's important because it helps to explain how we get Alternative 2, the idea of that rule was to make sure that subsidizing governments had flag state jurisdiction or some additional degree of control over the vessels it subsidized. But this is still an extremely sensitive issue for members with what are called open registries, countries who give their flag to a wide range of vessels from other countries. So what's in the new text is Alternative 1, the sort of classic reflagging rule, plus Alternative 2, which reflects, I think, sort of a different approach to the same problem. Instead of focusing a rule on the flag of a vessel, it focuses on whether the subsidizing member has jurisdiction or control over the vessels it subsidizes. So under Alternative 2, subsidies would be prohibited if the subsidizing member has neither jurisdiction nor control, nor the ability to ensure a vessel isn't contributing to overcapacity and overfishing. So the idea perhaps has the benefit of focusing more specifically on the underlying concern that I was describing before, that governments are subsidizing vessels they don't control. But it does also replace quite a simple factual question, the flag of the vessel, with 3 variables, including concepts like control, which might be harder to prove if a member wanted to challenge a subsidy under this provision. So there's pluses and minuses, I think, to the addition of Alternative 2, but it's an interesting new approach to address, I think, the problem that everybody agrees needs to be addressed. So that's Article 5. There's a lot there, and I promise the rest will be relatively short. Next, I'm going to cover the LDC and the technical assistance capacity building bits of the text relatively straightforwardly. There are 3 specific ideas for least developed countries. The first is that essentially what was an LDC exemption from Article 5.1 has been moved into Article 6 to sit with all of the other LDC exemptions. But the idea is the same, right? That LDCs, least developed country members, would get a permanent exemption from the prohibition in Article 5.1. They would, though, be required or still be subject to the best endeavours obligation, the one that was back in 5.4 for all of the other exemptions, still be subject to that obligation to ensure subsidies they provide don't contribute to overcapacity and overfishing. So that's the first idea, kind of a transport in from what used to be Article 5.5, now Article 5.4. The second idea in Article 6.2, now two options, essentially captures the idea that provisions, flexibilities for LDCs would continue to apply for a number of years after an LDC graduates out of LDC status. And there's a couple of different alternatives there, and I'll get back to them just in a second. So there's the exemption from 5.1, there's the idea of graduation and the exemptions continuing for some time after graduation. And the last in Article 6.3 is the idea that members should exercise due restraint in raising matters under this agreement with LDCs and take into account the LDC situation if they decide to do so. So now I'm going to come back to the graduation point. So there's two alternatives now in the text. This is new. So alternative 1 refers to a transition period after graduation for the exemption from Article 5.1. Okay. So alternative 2 here refers to a transition period after graduation for all provisions related to LDC members. Now, I think, as I read it, that's the only real difference between those two alternatives. And I think that means essentially that it means that, you know, if alternative 1 is the option, that ensures an extension of the exemption, but only the exemption from 5.1 after an LDC graduates. The wider language, provisions for LDCs, would ensure that LDCs get the benefit of all of the other provisions, like longer time periods for transparency, the due restraint provision, that they'd get the benefit of those for they would get the benefit of all of those provisions for the additional years after graduation. So I think it's a question of which provisions, which exceptions do you want to continue benefiting an LDC for some years after it graduates? I think that's the difference, but I'm keen to hear whether other people read it the same way. So that's LDCs. Technical assistance and capacity building, relatively straightforward, Article 7. I can't see anything particular that's changed, but it will be interesting to see how the discussions on technical assistance and a proposed voluntary trust fund might work. Next, we're going to look at Articles 8 and 9 together because they are really important, particularly Article 8. So two things to be aware of. As all of you well know, members have to notify basic information about their subsidies already under Article 25 of the Agreement on Subsidies. But under this agreement, they'd also have to notify two additional things: the type of fishing activity subsidised and the catch data. And here is where something has changed. So, and those two things, in fact, would need to be notified if you want to invoke the exception for subsidies to overfished stocks, a wider one, or the exemptions under 5.1.1 for overcapacity and overfishing, and importantly, the exemptions under special and differential treatment under Article 5. So everyone would have to do this if they want to use these exemptions. And so what's important here, it says new footnote. What's important in Article 8.1a is the addition of this footnote. So apparently there's been some discomfort around the catch data requirement, right, which would apply to anyone who wants to use S&DT under Article 5. But apparently the concern is not so much about the catch part, but about the by species part of that requirement. And the concern was that multi-species fisheries might not, or countries with multi-species fisheries might collect data on overall catch, but not catch per species. And so the chair has tried to take care of this in a footnote that explains that members with multi-species fisheries, for those fisheries, can provide other relevant and available catch data. So a bit more flexibility in using that important catch data notification, which you need to do to access the special differential treatment under Article 5. So, as you well know, as far as I can tell, there's not a lot else that's changed in Article 8.1. You still have 8.1b, which requires members to notify, to the extent possible, additional information if you want to use the fisheries management related exemptions. I think the only thing that's changed in 8.1b is that the chairs removed the brackets around the words "to the extent possible," essentially because there was general agreement that that was a useful sort of softening, a useful qualifier of that requirement. So the words, so the brackets have come out. So there's also special and differential treatment here. So developing and least developed members can provide the information under Article 8.1 every 4 years instead of every 2. And so there's some interesting substantive changes, I think, to some of the other parts of the transparency requirements in Article 8. So the first, and many of you will have seen this, the first in Article 8.2 is the addition of language on forced labour. So members would be obliged to notify the committee of vessels they've determined are engaged in IUU, the determinations that trigger the subsidy prohibition under Article 3, but would also be required to notify information about vessels that they have that suggests those vessels are engaged in the use of forced labour. Now, this is clearly a very important requirement for some members, but also a very sensitive topic overall. So it'll be interesting to see how that discussion evolves. The second really important substantive addition to Article 8.2 is that a lot more information would be required in notifications of fishing access agreements. Now, the previous draft from June required only that the title and the list of parties to the agreement be published. The new text would require quite a lot more detail: the full text of the agreement, the amounts paid by governments and the government purchasing access and by its fleet, the total allowable catch or licenses, number of licenses or capacity authorized, and in fact the list of authorized vessels and their details. So that's quite a lot of additional transparency that the text would require of access agreements. In Article 8.5, there's a little bit more additional language around the notification members are required to provide of their membership to RFMOs. So language essentially has been added, I think, to make this obligation easier to comply with in practice. So members can do collective notifications, perhaps by all members involved in the RFMO, and they can do it by providing a link to an appropriate website. So you don't have to provide screeds and screeds of paper. So those are some of the key additions, key changes in Article 2 and Article 8.5. Article 9, you'll remember institutional arrangements, the idea of the formation of a committee to monitor this, and one-off notifications that would need to be made when the agreement enters into force. No major substantive changes there as far as I can see. And then finally, on dispute settlement and final provisions, there weren't any changes that I could see that we specifically needed to talk about on Article 10 on dispute settlement. Basic rule for WTO's dispute settlement understanding as it's applied to the subsidies agreement also applies to this agreement. And then through Article 11, the final provisions, as many of you will have seen before, savings provisions for the rights of landlocked countries, sort of a note about unassessed stocks, exemptions for subsidies for disaster relief, and then the important and quite sensitive topic of how dispute settlement is applied, where there's a dispute over jurisdiction, essentially, over maritime areas. So we can come back to that, but I think it's probably a topic many of you are well familiar with. One important addition here, so it's in bold at the very bottom of the slide, the text now clarifies that other than as set out here in the agreement, members are not required to, certainly are not bound by, the decisions of any RFMOs that they're not parties to, and nothing in this agreement applies that those members even necessarily recognize those RFMOs. So something that very clearly, I think, delineates the scope of members' recognition an agreement to be bound by decisions of RFMOs that they may not be parties to. So that was, I think, sort of generated from, or reflects the concern of a number of members that there's a, that they may agree to be bound indirectly or to abide indirectly, or rather to have subsidy rules that reflect decisions of RFMOs they're not parties to, but that's where the degree of obligation stops. So useful text potentially. Very lastly, this is, I think, what we're going to be engaged in really for the next few weeks. Have we got the balance right? Looking over the whole agreement, how do we make sure that we've balanced enough prohibition and enough obligation and enough commitment, which is kind of in my head on the right-hand side of the slide, on the left-hand side of the slide, with enough flexibility, which is where I have it on the right-hand side. So have we balanced enough automaticity plus minimum duration, perhaps, with a balance of due process and procedure to ensure the automaticity doesn't lead to politically motivated determinations triggering an obligation? Have we got that balance of obligation and flexibility right? In overfished stocks, we have a strict prohibition, we have an exception for rebuilding subsidies. Do we want a wider exception there or not? Where do we strike the balance? On overcapacity and overfishing, we have the presumption that listed subsidies contribute to overcapacity and overfishing, and the list of subsidies, including now the contingent on subsidy. We have the options in 5.2 and for prohibition in 5.2 and 5.3, balanced against the qualification in 5.1.1 for management measures, balanced against the flexibility in special and differential treatment, which is now Article 4, artisanal fishing, non-artisanal fishing, de minimis members. I should have added LDCs. Have we got that balance right? And then in addition to all of that balance, we have the very real and very important notification and transparency obligations, which I think serve as an additional commitment and an additional form of of commitment and obligation on members. So this, I think, is one of the key questions I suspect for the next few weeks. Have we got all of those balances right within the provisions? And looking across the agreement, have we got the overall balance right? And that's, I suspect, what you're all spending a lot of time on. So I can see that there's already a quick question in the chat, so I'm going to stop there. And Eleonora, we can stop recording now. Thanks. So we can edit this if we need to later. So that's the end of the big long set of slides. I should say also I did prepare them without the benefit of Tristan's input. So Tristan can come in now and correct me if I've made any really glaring errors. But the floor is open. If you have questions or anything else that you'd like to raise, things that I think I might have gotten wrong, please feel free to raise your hands, and that way I can fix the slides before we put them online.